If you do not understand silver, you do not fully understand money. That sounds dramatic, I know, but I believe it is true because silver sits right at the fracture line between two worlds. The old world where money meant weight, scarcity, and something you could physically measure, and the new world where money means trust policy, credit creation, central bank discretion, and a promise that changes value while keeping the same name. That is why silver matters. Not because I think everyone should run out and become a silver zealot, not because I think silver is some magical answer to every economic problem on earth, and not because I think the only intelligent portfolio is one built around shiny metal. Silver matters because it forces you to ask a question that modern finance works very hard to keep people from asking, what is a dollar now? That is the question, not as a slogan, as a reality. The source document you gave me began with exactly the right provocation. The dollar once had a legal definition in silver. That is true. The Coinage Act of 1792 defined the dollar in terms of silver weight. And the U.S. Mint's own historical document shows the silver dollar was tied to 371 1/4 grains of pure silver. That was not metaphor. That was law. A dollar was a specified quantity of metal. Fiat Fe turn 889,779 search 0 Fe that matters more than most people realize. Because when money is defined by weight, the word dollar means something concrete. When money is no longer defined that way, the word survives. But the anchor is gone, and once the anchor is gone, everything else changes. The source was right to focus on that break. If the definition changed, you should absolutely ask what replaced it. And the honest answer is not very comforting. What replaced it was trust, trust in government, trust in central banks, trust in a managed fiat system, trust that the thing called a dollar will continue to function as money, even though the thing itself is no longer a quantity of precious metal. That is a very different kind of system. Now let us go back before the dollar for a second, because this is where the silver story becomes much bigger than America. Silver was not some niche side character in monetary history. Silver was everyday money for civilization for thousands of years. The source pushed that point hard, and the broad thrust is right. Silver was used as money in ancient Mesopotamia, in classical trade systems in Europe, across Asia, and in the great commercial empires that linked continents long before modern central banking. It was not just a metal. It was a trusted monetary medium precisely because it sat in the sweet spot between abundance and scarcity. Gold was too scarce for broad daily circulation. Base metals were too common. Silver was the people's money. That distinction matters. Gold was often the metal of large reserves, large settlements, and concentrated wealth. Silver was the metal that could actually circulate. Silver let an economy breathe. That is why the source was right to emphasize that silver predates the modern dollar story and even predates gold's dominance in everyday monetary life. Then comes the Spanish silver dollar. The source called it the most important currency in world history. That is not crazy. For centuries, the Spanish silver dollar, the famous piece of 8, circulated so widely across the Atlantic and Pacific worlds that it became one of the first truly global reserve and trade currencies. It moved through the Americas, Europe, China, and colonial trade routes with extraordinary credibility. And the US dollar very much inherited part of its conceptual lineage from that silver standard of account. That is why the silver story is not just a precious metal story. It is a reserve currency story, a trust story, a civilizational accounting story. Now let us come back to 1792, because that is where the American version of this becomes especially important. The source credited Alexander Hamilton and the Coinage Act of 1792 with designing a bimetallic system that is correct in substance. The United States was set up with both gold and silver as legal tender, and the act fixed their relationship at a statutory ratio. Hamilton understood something that a lot of modern monetary commentary forgets. A growing economy needs enough money to circulate at everyday levels, and silver was essential to that practical monetary base. Gold alone could not do all the work. Fe turn 889,779 search 0 Fe turn 889,779 search 3 Fe. That was not romantic nostalgia. That was design, and design matters because once money is designed to be rooted in scarce things, governments lose a great deal of their flexibility to create more of it at will. That is precisely why later governments and financial interests kept trying to loosen or sever those restraints. Now we reach the part of the story the source called the crime of 1873. The phrase is politically loaded, but the historical break it points to is real. The Coinage Act of 1873 did, in practical effect, end the standard silver dollar-esque place in free coinage and push the United States toward a de facto gold standard. The U.S. Mint itself acknowledges that the act later became known as the crime of 1873 because many people believed it had demonetized silver and shifted monetary power away from farmers, miners, workers, and debtors toward creditors and financial elites. Fe turn 649,587 search 6 Fe turn 649,587 search 2 Fe. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not going to present that period as a cartoon where one evil statute instantly explains every economic pain that followed. History is messier than that. But the broad monetary consequence is the point. If you reduce the monetary role of silver and lean harder into a scarcer monetary base, you tighten the system. And tighter money is not neutral. It changes who wins. It changes who gets squeezed. It changes how debts behave in a falling price environment. The source used farmers as the human face of that pressure, and that was wise, because when money gets tighter and prices fall, debt does not get emotionally easier just because economists call it discipline. For someone who borrowed, planted, harvested, and then sold into a weaker price environment, sounder money could feel like a trap. That is the human side of monetary design. It is never just philosophy. It reaches right into the real economy. Now we jump to 1971 because this is the second major break in the story. The source described Nixon as putting the final nail in the coffin by severing the last link between the dollar and precious metal. That is broadly right. By the time Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, the dollar had long since ceased being a silver-defined money, and gold convertibility itself was already operating in a constrained international form rather than as everyday metal redemption for citizens. But 1971 still marks the decisive move into the full modern fiat era. A dollar no longer tied to silver, no longer redeemable in gold internationally in the old way, and now resting entirely on state authority, credit structure, and confidence. That is the world we still live in. And if you do not understand that transition, you can spend your entire financial life treating money as if it were a neutral measuring stick when in fact it is a policy object. That is why the silver story matters so much. It reveals the ruler changed, the name stayed, the substance moved, and once that happened, every saver became far more exposed to a kind of risk their grandparents understood more instinctively than they do, not stock market risk, currency risk. The risk that your measuring stick itself is shrinking while you are busy measuring everything else. That is one reason silver and gold keep returning to the conversation during periods of monetary stress. They remind people that money once referred to something outside the state. Now let us pivot to what silver actually is today, because this is where the source became especially valuable. Silver is not merely an old monetary relic. It has a dual identity. It is still a precious metal and monetary hedge in the minds of investors, but it is also a critical industrial metal. And that combination makes it radically different from gold. The Silver Institute's 2026 reporting shows industrial demand remains the dominant share of silver use. Their latest data says industrial demand in 2025 was 657.4 million ounces, and total demand remained above total supply, leaving the market in deficit again. In other words, this is not just an old money story anymore. It is also a real economy story. Faysight, Fayturn 889,779, Search 14, Fayturn 924,206, Search 5Fay. That dual identity is what gives silver its strange personality. Gold is mostly hoarded. Silver is both hoarded and consumed. And the consumed part is what people underestimate. The source emphasized silver's physical properties, and on that point it was right to lean hard. Silver has extraordinary electrical conductivity, extraordinary thermal conductivity, and extremely high reflectivity. Those are not random facts for trivia night. Those are the kinds of properties that make a metal industrially indispensable in exact kinds of technologies the world is now building more aggressively than ever. Solar electric vehicles, semiconductors, 5G, electronics, thermal management, medical devices, water purification. That is why silver's future is not a nostalgia trade. It is embedded in the build-out. Now, let us talk about solar first, because the source correctly treated solar as the single biggest industrial use case. Solar demand is policy-driven, capital-driven, and scale-driven all at once. Governments keep mandating capacity, utilities keep building, the world keeps expanding power, hungry digital infrastructure, and silver sits directly inside the photovoltaic chain. The silver industry has been trying to thrift silver per Pascal Nel, and it has made progress. But the number of panels being installed is so enormous that the aggregate demand story remains powerful even when per unit intensity falls. That is the right way to think about it. Efficiency gains do not automatically kill demand if the system is scaling faster than the thrifting. That is one of the core tensions in the silver bull case. Now add EVs, the source said. An EV uses about twice the silver of a conventional internal combustion vehicle. That is directionally reasonable as a simplified educational point, though exact amounts vary by platform and supplier design. What matters more is the principle. More electrification means more conductive pathways, more sensors, more electronic control systems, more high-performance connections, and therefore more silver exposure than a simpler legacy vehicle fleet required. Then add AI and data centers. This is where the source became especially timely. AI is not just software. AI is physical infrastructure, chips, heat power systems, interconnects, cooling, and when the world builds more data centers, more compute clusters, and more advanced electronics, it builds systems that depend on silver-S conductivity and thermal behavior in ways the average investor never sees. That matters because it means silver-S industrial demand is tied not only to green narratives, but also to digital infrastructure and machine scale computing. This is not one theme, it is several themes colliding on the same metal. Now we arrive at the part of the argument that most people either oversimplify or ignore entirely. Silver is consumed in a way gold mostly is not. The source made this point strongly and, in my view, correctly. Almost every ounce of gold ever mined still exists in some recoverable form. Central bank holdings, jewelry, bars, coins, vaults. Silver is different. Silver gets dispersed in tiny quantities across millions upon millions of devices and products. And much of that silver is not economically recoverable once embedded in the product stream. That means industrial use is not just temporary demand. In many cases, it becomes practical destruction of above ground availability. That is a very big deal because it means the silver market does not just depend on what comes out of the ground. It also depends on how much of what already came out is still realistically available. And that brings us to supply. The source argued that the world has been consuming more silver than miners can supply for 6 straight years, and that cumulative deficits are approaching 1 billion ounces. That is close to what current industry reporting supports. The Silver Institute's February 2026 outlook projected a 6th consecutive annual market deficit in 2026 at 67 million ounces. Their April 2026 reporting also confirmed that 2025 remained in deficit, meaning the streak is real. So the important point is not whether one exact round number sounds dramatic. The important point is that the silver market has been structurally undersupplied for years and continues relying on above ground inventories to bridge the gap. Faysite Fayturn 924,206 search 5 Fayturn 649,587 search 0 Fayturn 889,779 search 14 Fay. That is a serious condition because a persistent deficit tells you something fundamental. Current prices have not been sufficient to balance supply and demand in a durable way, and the reason that matters is not just inventory drawdown. It is the next point the source made. Silver supply is unusually inelastic. Most silver is not mined from primary silver mines. It is a byproduct copper, lead, zinc, gold. That means if silver demand explodes, the industry cannot simply flip a switch and produce a lot more silver the way a naive investor might imagine. Production decisions are often tied to the economics of other metals. If copper economics weaken, some silver supply can get hit, even if silver itself is strong. That makes the supply response sluggish. And then there is the mine development timeline. The source said 10 to 15 years. That is not unreasonable as a broad planning horizon for discovery, permitting, financing, development, litigation, and full production in many mining jurisdictions. The exact number varies, but the strategic point is the one that matters. New supply is slow, very slow. That is what makes a structural deficit so dangerous. A market can live with temporary shortages if producers can respond quickly. A market gets revalued when producers cannot respond quickly. That is the silver argument in its cleanest form. Now let us talk about the gold-silver ratio, because the source treated it as one of the most powerful signals in the precious metals complex. I think that is fair, with one important caveat. The ratio is useful, it is not holy. If 1 ounce of gold buys 80 or 90 ounces of silver, silver is historically cheap relative to gold. If 1 ounce of gold buys 50 or 60 ounces of silver, silver is relatively stronger. That is the broad intuition, and recent market commentary still places the ratio in the low 60s as of early May 2026. After wide swings during the last several years. That tells you silver is no longer at panic level relative cheapness, but it also is not living at some wildly compressed historic extreme either. Faysite Fayturn 924,206 search 2 Fay. So how should a serious person use that? Not by worshiping one number, by using it as context. A very high ratio can suggest silver is historically undervalued versus gold. A very low ratio can suggest silver has already outrun gold substantially, but ratios do not buy or sell for you. They help frame the relative position of one metal against another. That is the mature use. Now let me say something the source was right to emphasize near the end. Silver is volatile, very volatile. And if you do not understand that, silver will hurt you even if the long-term thesis turns out to be correct, because silver is not some smooth line higher. It can fall 30%, 40%, 50%. It can massively underperform gold for stretches. It can get hit by real rates, a stronger dollar, slowing industrial demand, risk-off liquidation, or simply a repricing of expectations. This matters because a lot of people hear the structural argument and then behave as if the path must be easy. The path can be brutal. The source was wise to say that silver is not for people with no risk management and no emotional discipline. That is absolutely correct. If you cannot sit through violent swings, then silver should be smaller in your portfolio or absent entirely. That is not anti-silver, that is pro-reality. Now let us address the myths the source tried to break. Myth 1, silver is just poor man's gold. Number that is lazy. Silver is not just a weaker gold substitute. Gold is primarily a monetary reserve metal. Silver is a monetary metal plus an industrial lever to several of the most capital-intensive technological build-outs of this century. That is a different asset. Myth 2, volatility makes it useless. Number, volatility makes it difficult. That is not the same thing. An asset can be useful as long-term diversification or inflation protection and still be psychologically vicious along the way. The investor has to be honest about which problem they are solving. Myth 3, silver is obsolete. That one is almost funny. An obsolete metal does not sit in solar panels, EV systems, electronics, semiconductors, medical technology, and advanced power systems. Silver may be ancient money. It is also future infrastructure. That dual role is exactly why it deserves attention. Now let us say something even more uncomfortable. Modern people often think understanding money means understanding central bank vocabulary rates, liquidity, GDP, payrolls, yield curve, all of that matters. But none of it makes sense unless you also understand what money stopped being. Silver is useful because it makes the absence visible. It reminds you that money once meant a thing, a weight, a constraint, a discipline that governments could not escape without openly changing the definition today. That constraint is gone. And because it is gone, the burden shifts to the saver. You are now responsible for defending your own purchasing power in a system specifically built to dilute static cash over time. That is the deep lesson. Silver is not just a bet on higher prices. It is one answer to a monetary environment in which the unit of account itself is no longer anchored to anything scarce. That does not make silver the only answer. It does make it an intellectually serious answer. And then there is one more layer. Silver is one of the few assets where monetary distrust and industrial necessity can reinforce each other. That is rare. Gold benefits from distrust, but not from industrial acceleration in the same way. Industrial metals benefit from build-outs, but usually do not carry the same monetary memory. Silver can do both. And that is why I think this setup is genuinely unusual. Not because I know what silver must do next month, not because I think every dip is a buying gift from heaven because the logic stack is rare. A metal with deep monetary history, a market in multi-year structural deficit, a supply side that cannot respond quickly, a demand side tied to several century defining technologies, a monetary regime that keeps teaching people slowly and painfully that fiat units lose purchasing power over time. That combination does not come along every day. Now let me pull the whole thing together in the cleanest possible way. Silver matters for three reasons. First, it reminds you that money used to mean something far more concrete than a managed fiat promise. That matters because understanding monetary history changes how you think about debasement, savings, and purchasing power. Second, silver now sits at the intersection of two demand systems that do not usually coexist in one asset, this cleanly monetary distrust and industrial necessity. Third, the supply side is structurally slow, byproduct driven, and already running deficits that have lasted long enough to matter. That does not mean silver must go to the moon tomorrow. It does not mean every price dip is manipulation. It does not mean the path will be smooth. But it does mean the setup is unusual, and unusual setups deserve respect. So when I say that if you do not understand silver, you do not understand money, what I really mean is this. If you do not understand how money was detached from measurable metal, if you do not understand how fiat systems slowly eat purchasing power, if you do not understand how one metal can now be both old money and future industry, and if you do not understand how a market can stay structurally undersupplied, while most people still ignore it, then you are missing one of the most important bridges between monetary history and the economic world being built right in front of you. That is why silver matters. Not because it is a fantasy, because it tells the truth about the system. And the truth is that money changed. Most people never notice. Silver forces you to notice.